Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. We'll talk with experts on a wide range of topics, including nutrition, stress relief, sleep, mental health, etc.
And we'll dig into the issues that can cause fertility challenges, like PCOS, or early menopause, or cancer treatment.
So if you're curious about your fertility, whether you're ready to start a family,
or you're preserving your options for the future, let's dig in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Whole Pineapple, and we have something special for you today. We are talking research.
Woo, everybody's favorite thing, statistics.
No. Don't turn it off. Don't turn it off. You're going to like it. It's good.
Ruby and I are both a little bit science nerdy in terms of really getting excited about not just what we feel should be the case, but like, ooh, what's the evidence? What do we have? How do we really know that we're really providing best practice? And so we're super excited to be able to talk with someone today that's actually been working and looking at these issues and figuring out how we can improve care in terms of fertility.
Yeah, research guides most of what we do, and it's nice to talk to somebody that's on that end of things. So today we are introducing Eleanor Stevenson, PhD, RN. She is a clinical professor of nursing at Duke University of Nursing, where she teaches DNP, MSN, and ABSN programs. She received her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Rutgers University, New Brunswick, her Master's in Science as a women's health nurse practitioner from Rutgers University College of Nursing, Newark. She received her PhD in nursing research and theory development from New York University College of Nursing. Her area of focus include the multidimensional psychological stress for people who have conceived pregnancies via in vitro fertilization, as well as the adaptive behaviors of people with sperm factor infertility, along with several other fertility and reproductive areas of study. Eleanor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And a lot of people don't realize, it's not the most common path in the field to have a PhD in nursing. So I think that's kind of my first question. I want to know a little bit more about what drove you to devote such a huge chunk of your life, because I think it's so amazing. And I wish there were more nurses that went all the way into that research side.
So it's about 1% of nurses will go and pursue a PhD. It is a small number indeed. I've just always loved research. I've always had endless questions. And when I got to the point where I had questions that I wanted to learn more deeply about, that was the time I realized I was ready for a PhD, where I could then craft my own research studies to find the answers to those things. Because, as you all said, what we do as nurses should be evidence-based, and in large part it is, and there's definitely room for improvement. By having a PhD and being able to conduct research, I can help add evidence to the literature that help nurses and other healthcare providers deliver care to our patients that truly is steeped in science. And that's really important for the care and safety of our patients.
And a lot of people, when they think of like research studies, they think of those pharmaceutical studies, with the double-blind placebo-controlled trials. So tell us a little bit. Yours isn't quite like that. It's a different type of research. So tell us the difference between your research and something that is more of that double-blind, the traditional, what people think of.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because what was the final deciding factor for going back for my PhD was I actually was working for pharmaceutical companies doing drug trials, looking at those double-blind placebo-controlled trials. And while they're really important for drug development, it really wasn't the kind of questions I was really interested in. In my area, I don't do those large randomized controlled trials. Most of my questions don't really need trials of that scale and that design. The research I participate in, it is clinical research. I still work with patients. I still collect data from patients, from real people that it affects. But a lot of my research, at least lately, has even been qualitative research. So I was trained as a quantitative researcher.
And explain a little bit what the difference between those two are.
So quantitative research collects numbers, essentially, and uses those numbers to be able to answer research questions. And you can apply statistics to be able to decide whether things are clinically significant or not, to be able to answer those research questions. It can be done through a randomized control trial, but there are other kind of design strategies that can also help with that, and more observational trials, which are some of the kinds of trials that I've conducted. And then there's also qualitative research where we collect data that is not as number focused. There are a lot of different ways you can do it, but the type of qualitative research I've participated in has been through in-depth interviews where I'll interview people who I'm interested in what's going on for a particular question, and I will come up with questions that are specific to the area I'm interested in, and I will then utilize a rigorous methodology to be able to extract themes and help understand a situation or an experience with more depth than you would through just hard numbers, so to speak.
And I think it's so important to highlight the difference between those, because I know from my experience in school, I think everyone always brushes off qualitative research. It's like, oh, you're just listening to people say and writing down the responses. And I think for listeners, if you've ever been part of the healthcare system, you see how we're trying to make everybody be a number, right? Like, what's your pain? Is it 1 in 10? Fill out this questionnaire. Like, we like to try and get people to be numbers so that it's easier to play with the data and run statistics. But there's so much value from having that larger view. And there's so much research behind how to do qualitative research. You're not just on your own making up a framework, but there is a lot of background for how you can take more messy responses and still organize them to be able to learn from that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so qualitative research really does allow you to understand phenomenon pretty deeply. We don't generalize our qualitative research, but it really does help inform some of that quantitative research. What often happens is you'll understand a phenomenon really well, and that will then hopefully allow for a much more precise or robust quantitative evaluation. And then you can also do them together, really create really interesting ways to understand a phenomenon, depending on whatever your question is.
Especially when we're looking at people, like when we're just trying to test chemical compounds, it makes sense that we can really kind of control for everything, but people are very complicated. So you do have to take more of that big picture approach, I think, to make anything that is going to be useful for future practice.
Absolutely.
You can apply it to the analogy of the egg, because we talk a lot about quantity and quality in in our area. So the quantity, it's a little bit straightforward, right? It's like, this is how many eggs we retrieved. This is, how many that were fertilized. We have the numbers. The quality is a little bit more complex and it's harder to define.
Yeah, and people's experiences are really complex, right? And so that's why it really, from a researcher standpoint, using that kind of methodology is really interesting and robust and really just helps me as a researcher understand the phenomenon I'm trying to understand more about.
And were you already working in this field of fertility when you then got your PhD, or did you is in this after you'd already been working in other areas? I know you mentioned the drug trial, but...
It's kind of an interesting, I don't know if it's a story, but when I started my PhD program, I was actually interested in looking at pregnancy, but specifically I was interested in looking at preterm birth and what were potential contributors to preterm birth. And I was interested in psychological stress because there is a biological link between psychological stress and preterm birth. And that had been established in the literature that people who are pregnant, who they have excessive stress in their lives, may be at risk for having an early term birth. And so I was interested in particular populations, not in the fertility and fertility setting, because I hadn't worked in that space yet. I had worked in all other areas of birth and women's health and family planning, but not in the fertility setting. And I hadn't done my research yet. I was still a PhD student, and I took a job at an infertility center, at a big fertility center up in the Northeast. And I just was really captivated by the science. And I was really drawn to the patients that we were taking care of and really interested in, the experience. It completely changed my entire PhD research topic. And so I still ended up looking at stress, psychological stress, but the population changed for me. And so I ended up completing my PhD research looking at the time it was women who would conceive pregnancies through in vitro fertilization. I then went on to look at couples and extend that research with another couple of studies. But that was my initial inquiry, was looking at people who were pregnant through IVF and whether they experienced increased levels of stress during the pregnancies that resulted.
What did you find?
So in the studies I've done, people are more stressed. And stress, I will just put a quick pause on the thought that stress is actually a really complicated phenomenon. It's a really complicated concept. How I define stress might be different than how other people define stress. But I really did try to define stress, the way I think the majority of well-respected stress researchers were looking at it, which was from a multidimensional type of approach. and that stress wasn't just one experience. There's different types, there's anxiety, all sorts of things that kind of contribute to the experience of stress. What I found was that actually these patients experience, so if you look at different types of stress, patients have much more anxiety. There's no question about it. But some of the other types of stress that I measured, because I measured about 4 different types of stress. Some of the other stress wasn't necessarily of concern and wasn't part of the experience, but perceived anxiety definitely was. And there's actually a couple of kinds of anxiety. And the type of anxiety that people who conceived through IVF were experiencing was pregnancy-related anxiety. It is a specific type of anxiety. And
hello, doggy.
And there's also podcast dog barking anxiety.
Yeah.
so, yes, indeed. I don't know if she agrees with my assessment of anxiety, but she and I can talk later. And so, yeah, people who conceived through IVF definitely so that first research study was in the first trimester, roughly, first half of pregnancy, definitely were experiencing high levels of pregnancy-related anxiety. And then in my next study, I looked at people who were pregnant plus their partners, and I actually measured their stress and anxiety throughout the pregnancy at 3 different time points. And it did persist. It kind of peaked and it kind of dropped at different points, but it did exist.
I think that's fascinating because I think it's something that we don't talk enough about, but that we are getting more awareness on. I think a lot of people, when they're in the midst of fertility treatment, feel like, but once I'm pregnant, I'm going to feel so happy. I'm going to be so relaxed. I'll be what I've always imagined I would be in pregnancy. And I don't really think that's the case for the majority of people. I mean, we only see people early on, but even in that visit, a lot of people are surprised by how nervous they feel, even when everything's looking good, even when we're doing their final ultrasound with us and everything looks on track and we're so happy for them. I see a lot of people that are afraid to let themselves be happy because they've had to go through something so hard. And I think they wonder, why am I feeling this way? And so I think it's good to realize how common that experience is, and that pregnancy doesn't just magically fix the struggle that you've been going through to get to that point.
I would agree with that. And, I was kind of inspired to look at this particular research question based on some personal experience with some friends. And one friend in particular that's coming to mind who struggled quite a lot and then did become successfully pregnant. She said to me, and this was so many years ago, I remember she said that she wouldn't allow herself to look an extra week ahead in her pregnancy book. Whatever she was, 19 weeks, she would look at, whatever book she was reading. And I remember saying to her, why is that? And she said, I just can't allow myself to think that this is going to happen. And it sat with me. And then, I started working in this area and I thought, this is a real experience. And I think for people who really have had to struggle and have had to work hard to get to that place, and emotionally, physically, all of it, it's really hard for people to give up some of those old feelings and just think it's going to magically disappear. What it did for me in thinking about it from a care standpoint was just understanding that, when patients do go off to their obstetrician or their midwife or whomever is going to care for them, that we need to make sure that those providers are able to continue the good support that I think the majority of patients receive when they go through the fertility care side. And it's just really important for everyone to understand that this is a sometimes complicated experience for people. Even when it's joyous, even when it's healthy, it's complicated.
I think that's so great for your study too, that you looked at those different points, because I do feel like by the time someone's at the end of pregnancy, it's rare for anyone in the chart to be reflecting on, oh, and I see you had an embryo transfer. Like, it's just not the top of people's minds. And often it might not be something the patient's bringing up, but you're right, it's still there in the background. Even for me, when I had my daughter after our treatment, like, I remember being surprised after she was born, like sobbing and telling my husband, like, I have a baby. Like, I can't believe I have a baby. Like, going through all this, I was afraid to believe that it would really, in the end, someone would hand me a baby. Like, it just, in that back of my mind, when you've wanted something for so long and tried and had, not the success, then you are afraid to let yourself believe that in the end, it's going to actually work out. And I think that is a common reaction. I think my labor nurses who knew me from before were also surprised at my reaction. Like, yeah, that's why you're here. So it does, I think, shape the whole experience in a way that people might not necessarily realize. Not for everybody. Probably some people are totally fine, but having worked as a labor and delivery nurse before I went through my own fertility, my experience of how I felt in labor was not at all what I thought I would have, because going through the treatment first really did shift how I felt like I could trust in anything.
I worked in high-risk pregnancies, so antepartum when I worked in the hospital, and there was a distinct difference, at least noticeable anecdotally for me, when I had patients that had gone through fertility treatment and then people that are there that had not gone through fertility treatment, the people that have gone through fertility treatment already had this stressful backstory, and now they are yet in another high risk kind of situation. So the processing was a lot different. Whereas the people that have not had fertility treatment, they are coming at this stressful situation. This is the first one that they've encountered, potentially.
Well, I mentioned, I think to you before, Ruby, when I was in school, one of the things we had to do in our program was go to a workshop about how to start a birth center because they wanted us to understand more about out-of-hospital birth. We toured a great facility in Minnesota. I mean, it was a really great place. And they mentioned just offhandedly, one of their exclusion criteria was fertility treatment. And I raised my hand and be like, well, why don't you take patients who've had fertility treatment? And they said, well, in the beginning we did if they were otherwise low risk, but we found we had a 100% transfer rate. Everybody, even if it was early on in labor and we weren't concerned, they all of a sudden didn't feel safe in that situation. So they decided, even if people don't think they're going to be anxious, think they want this, something about that process of actually now being in labor, they found that with that background, everybody wanted to transfer, wanted to be in the hospital, was feeling nervous about it. So now they just didn't accept patients.
Wow, that's interesting. There's another study for you.
I know.
I had that experience as well. I started my career as a labor nurse, and I wish I could go back to my much younger self and have that perspective back then, because it wasn't on my radar as a brand new 22-year-old nurse. I, like Ruby, have a similar experience. I remember definitely some of the patients talking about their experiences very differently. And I had a patient who had tried for something like 14 years or something like that, and specifically remember the couple's provider basically, kind of being like, oh, you kind of had labor, let's just do a C-section. And I thought to myself, why? What shouldn't we, have a labor kind of a thing? And the provider's like, it was this shared understanding that, we weren't taking any chances with this pregnancy because of the experience. And I think it was in part because this patient, you also have to remember this was the time that people were doing a lot more elective C-sections. It was a different time.
Too posh to push. I remember all the articles.
Oh, dear.
That's right. Back then, yeah. And that was not uncommon for patients to say they wanted a C-section. This patient wanted a C-section. And I just, in my naivete, didn't understand why. And now I totally understand it. I get that this patient just wanted to have the baby in her arms and
get me through it. Yeah, get me through it. That's understandable. Yeah.
So doing that initial research, is that what kind of drove you more than to go from looking at women to the couple to then I know a lot of your more research now has been more on the sperm side, and just from the way that research is done, I know that's all coded as kind of male infertility and the male experience. So,
and I'll jump in here too for just like a little word about research. As we had mentioned before, it's kind of similar that research likes black and white. It helps us be able to reproduce data and make sure that we can explain why we got the evidence that we got. So in that, the terms that we use tend to be more gendered. And in this research, we're talking more specifically about cisgender heterosexual men and cisgender heterosexual women, because that does change data. The experiences do change depending on how you identify.
I did move on from my research looking at stress during pregnancies. It was somewhat of a serendipitous meeting with a urologist who was really impassioned about the fact that his particular patients weren't getting a lot of attention in the clinical and research area. And we had a conversation that just got me thinking about new research questions. And so I pivoted and began to do some research looking at the experience of, at the time, the first study that we worked on looked at the experience of people with severe male factor fertility. And as Ruby said, the participants in that particular study did all identify as cis heterosexual men. They were all men who had a diagnosed severe male factor diagnosis. And so they either had no sperm or had really, really poor sperm counts. We were interested to see what their experiences were during the fertility process. And so it came from a place of his experience where he practices he was an embedded urologist in a fertility center, not in this country. He actually is across the pond in the United Kingdom. But, I knew that wasn't always the experience for patients. And so for when couples were going through treatment, for the female part of the partner, that person was receiving the treatment from the fertility center. And in many cases, the partner who produced sperm was not really seen or very often seen. And in some cases, even sperm counts and those sorts of analyses were posted to the partners chart and those sorts of things. We got to talking and said, we need to understand this a little bit more. And so we developed a qualitative study, and this was my pivot into qualitative research. And we looked at couples with a diagnosis of severe male factor infertility. And we looked at them both in the UK and the United States because we wanted to see if there was a difference between the experience between two different systems, specifically related to funding, because the United Kingdom healthcare has, because of their national health service, they do provide fertility care for a lot of their patients. And in this country, and where I sampled from, we're not a mandated state. And so a lot of our patients were paying out of pocket.
I just have to toss in the visit I did just before this was a graduation ultrasound for a couple who were from the UK, and they were so cute because they're like, so we're not from here. What do we do next? Like, do we just call the hospital? And I was like, no, I'm sorry. Our system is awful. It's like, you're going to have to pick a provider. And I'm trying to explain. And I was like, here's how midwifery works here versus here. I mean, I was like this, it's interesting when you have to just like talk somebody through it and be like, yeah, I'm sorry. This is going to be a journey for you.
I don't think I've ever had that experience of having tried to explain what our system.
It was just before this.
Dear.
I was like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry for you. It's going to be a challenge.
To all of our UK listeners, I apologize.
Yes.
Well, that was definitely something that we wanted to see how it potentially influenced their experience, because the ability to pay for treatment is a concern for a lot of people. When you're talking about family building decisions, money for a lot of people is part of that discussion. So that's why we wanted to do both countries. And we looked at these couples during 3 time points during their treatment. So from the time they were first, relatively shortly after they were first diagnosed, and were seen by a fertility urologist. And then we interviewed them every roughly 3 to 4 months. So for about 6 to 9 months, we had 3 conversations with the men with the diagnosis.
And did you talk to them by themselves?
Yep, absolutely. So that was one of the decisions that we had to make as researchers was, were we going to interview them together or were we going to interview them separately? And we decided to do separately. And so we also interviewed their partners, 3 time points, separate time periods, like, on a different day or whatnot. We made separate appointments with them. The questions we asked the partner, it was interesting. When you go into qualitative research, one of the common ways to do it is you have what we call semi-structure interview questions. And so they're all founded based on the literature and what you're trying to understand, but you do go in with a set of questions. You're a little flexible with them, but you do have questions. And so the questions we crafted, and it was around a theoretical model that we were using. And the questions we were asking the female partner was about their perception of how their male partner was dealing with this diagnosis. It's important for me to note because our findings were really rich and provided us with those data, but also we learned a lot more also about the female experience of being partnered with somebody with a severe male factor problem, because you have to understand that these female partners were doing the bulk of the physical treatment for family building, right? So they were going through the in vitro cycles and whatnot when they didn't have a diagnosis. And it was the male partners who were either having to do a surgical sperm retrieval or using third party or donor sperm. And so it just was an interesting dynamic that we ended up exploring with a lot of these partners.
Ruby and I both have all kinds of stories about the vast way that people process that scenario, because some people are very resentful, and it's a little bit of you walk in the room like, oh gosh, this person seems really angry to be here, and they want to tell you from the beginning, it's my husband's sperm. Like it's interesting to me to see that dynamic, because other people, it's completely the opposite. Like, we're all in this together, we're a team, it's brought us closer. So there is a wide range of how people deal with this really stressful situation, because it is tough if a diagnosis is on one side, but pretty much all what happens beyond that point does impact the other person.
What was interesting in looking at the female data, and I'll say this with caution because it's qualitative data. So if you remember earlier, you can't generalize your findings, but I did find it interesting when we looked at the data. And what we found was that the female partners either were completely supportive of their male partners and tried to actually reduce their partner guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And so they actually worked to kind of help feelings, so to speak, or they didn't and were resentful. And so it's kind of was one or the other. I know resentment may not be the right word, but just where it was an awareness that it was his problem and not hers.
I guess just defensiveness is maybe a better word, that a lot of people feel the need to explain to me, oh, well, all my testing has been normal, this and that, or, it's just a different dynamic that I often see.
Well, and the bulk of our partners, honestly, their relationship got stronger through the process, which I found to be really interesting.
So see, this episode's not a downer. Everybody who's listening can have some good things too.
I know for a lot of people, stress is a 4-letter word going through fertility treatment. So sometimes just hearing the word stress, you're like, oh, please don't tell me not to stress.
Yeah.
But they did see it as a shared experience. That was the good news is, like I said, after having interviewed them over time, both partners, the majority of them reported they felt their relationship was actually stronger as a result. When there was this mentality of we're in this together, there wasn't that resentment or that guilt as much from either partner. And so that was, to me, really an informative insight into looking at the dynamics between the couple as they're trying to work towards this goal, right?
Did you have any difficulty when you were interviewing the male partners in terms of, expressing and answering questions, or were people pretty, because I feel like we don't talk to people enough. Like almost all of our consults are usually both people together, and not to generalize too much, but often that conversation is more of the questions coming from the female side. So how was that process of interviewing? Was it the same, or did you find like you had to work a little harder to get a conversation going?
I actually had no problem interviewing. So I did all the interviews here in the United States for all the participants. And I actually had a research nurse in the UK because of time zone, and she was a nurse in that clinic. So I did not do those interviews, although I read all the transcripts, but I didn't actually do those interviews. I can say for here, I purposely did my interviews over the phone, and I didn't do it through Zoom or any sort of video or in person. And I did that intentionally because I felt like that allowed patients to feel like they're, it was a little bit more, I won't say anonymous because they knew who I was, but a little more private. The female partners were very happy to share with me, and that didn't surprise me, to be honest. And I think that was in some ways therapeutic for a lot of people. I think they found being able to talk to me, even though I took a researcher standpoint and not a therapist standpoint, and the nurse in me who might want to try to, ease somebody's thinking about a situation, I had to hold myself off from doing that. When you're doing research, you can't be a clinician as well. But for the male partners, I actually received really, really rich information from them. And I had hour-long conversations with them. And I honestly think that they were relieved to have the ability to talk to somebody who was interested, and they got to tell their side of it. One of the findings that came out is that actually men don't seek out emotional support as much as the female partners were doing. And they didn't have therapists. They didn't often confide in their peer groups. They didn't tell friends. They didn't tell sometimes even family members about what they were going through. There was definitely a lot of stigma associated with the diagnosis and the experience. But I honestly think that them talking to me, they felt like they had somebody who would listen. They were really quite vulnerable. So, and I was really grateful for that. I mean, it was quite a privilege.
Was one of the questions whether they'd also shared these feelings with their partner? Because I feel like for me personally, when we were going through all this, my diagnosis was severe male factor. And one of my frustrating things is that my husband never wanted to talk about it with me. But I do think he would have talked about it with somebody else. He just didn't want to talk about it with me.
I think there were some that definitely did not want to talk about it with their partners, or at least reveal their true feelings about it. One of the themes that came out, we just called it avoidance. And that was kind of a broad theme. And it was either avoidance from talking to peer group, but sometimes it was also the partner. The male partners tend to be much more kind of action oriented. So definitely found some positive things that came out of it, which was, men like to focus on the goal and, what do we need to do to achieve a pregnancy or whatnot, and being supportive of their partner when they were going through their procedures. And they really did appreciate the support they received from their healthcare team. And they did appreciate the support they got from their partners when it was offered, for sure.
I think we probably I shouldn't say it that way, because I think we just process things differently. I think he in general doesn't like to talk about things as much as I will. So he probably feels like he opened up all he wanted to and he didn't have anything else to say. And he didn't want to continue to rehash everything with me. So
yeah, I feel like Dion does that to me too. I'm like, but I'm not done talking. He's like, oh, well, I still have talking. I still want to continue. And he just looks at me like, oh, okay.
Mine would be like, I said that sucks. What else do you want me to say?
Right,
I
yeah.
admit that it sucks. So is that how you then kind of got down that path of now doing more research on stigma? Because that's one of your other areas, right?
Haven't done a lot on stigma outside this area. I'm just interested in these healthcare structures that have been primarily focused around women. And where does that leave partners when really decision making and care really should be couple based or family based? And how do we improve care more holistically? And so with the fertility, I definitely have seen a shift in this country since I started looking at this question however many years ago, that we're doing a much, much better job. I think a lot of clinics, anecdotally, I'll say anecdotally from those I know across the country, that partners are much more thoughtfully incorporated into the care. And I think that that's a sign that we're doing better as healthcare providers.
Oh, yeah, even just in our clinic, when we started, I think we had one part-time urologist, and now we have 3 urologists. So I think even just having the people, as you said in the beginning, embedded in the clinic. So it's just, you're not having to wait for the 1 day a month that the traveling person is there. Like, it's just like any other visit. Let's get you set up for this appointment with this person. So,
well, and that they're even getting appointments. 10 years ago, maybe, as long as there was adequate sperm to do an IVF or ICSI cycle, the male partner often didn't even get a physical evaluation to understand, is there a potential reason for this diagnosis? That's part of why I'm interested in this more holistic kind of approach. If there is a potential underlying cause that's maybe treatable, that would be great. And so family building is, in my mind, the short-term goal. But having healthy people, parents, if they end up having children, is also as big of a goal.
And we've talked about in previous episodes with other guests about how this fertility journey is often a step into the healthcare world where a lot of people are otherwise, they think healthy and doing okay and not seeking treatment for anything else. And then it can be kind of a window into general health. Sometimes sperm health and egg health too, but sometimes that can be like the canary in the coal mine to give us an idea that something else is going on. So this whole podcast is about being holistic and looking at the whole person. So, and I don't know, like there's certainly we have gone in the direction of being much more like couple inclusive or relationship inclusive when we have our visits, but I definitely tends to be female heavy because we're seeing them the most, seeing the most treatment. I'm just thinking about how COVID's complicated things.
I just think that'd be a fascinating research study to see, like, now that we're doing so much more telehealth, I find that I see way more people where they're both present for follow-ups because it's just so much easier. Even if they're in different locations, they're both at work, they can both join the Zoom and be a part of it, as opposed to, I think in the past, if someone was having a follow-up after an unsuccessful cycle, most of the time it would just be the female partner. I wouldn't see both people coming together. And I do feel like I see more people together now, but I don't know if that's just our clinic, or maybe in other parts of the country, they're doing more in person. But because we're so telehealth based still, I think that has been one positive.
But I don't know how it's been US wide, but there's less visits that partners could attend during the peak of the pandemic. I think those Zoom calls, those telemedicine calls have been pretty helpful to actually see who you're seeing.
The Zoom calls, and also what's interesting to me is now that we're letting partners be present for inseminations, I feel like I have way more present. I think because they couldn't come in for so long. And so now people are like, oh, I want to be there for the IUI versus I think in the old days, people would come to the first one and be like, oh, I'm just sitting there. You're fine. But now I think people want to be doing this together, I think a little bit more than I saw in the past.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I'm just thinking of all the ways that we could try to make our practice better at incorporating partners more intentionally.
A lot of it will come down to the logistics, but if telehealth can assist in some of that, I think that's really important. I think the key is to making sure questions are answered and stories are heard and creating the space for that. Because, at least in our research, we found that misinformation and the internet was a big source for people. As healthcare providers, we all know that that's a challenge, making sure patients get the right information. And so figuring out how do we make sure both patients are getting the information they need so they can feel like they know what's going on, they have agency over their decisions and choices.
So, what are some of the other things that came out in your research about how to improve the experience? So, I guess you can't draw too many generalizations, but what are some of the challenges that you found that we should know as providers as we think about how we can be better?
Areas of interest.
Yes.
Areas of interest. So one of the things was the informational gap. That was something that we found that the men in our study really wanted to seek out information. They just didn't know where to do it. So I've done some work to try to bridge some of that gap in providing some evidence-based topics and education to patients on these really complicated topics. As healthcare providers, I think we have to appreciate that it's complicated. I think sometimes patients don't know the questions to necessarily ask because it's so complicated and there's so much information. And so I think it's trying to figure out where your patients are at that time, because, you both know fertility treatment is a journey, right? And what you know and understand today and decisions you make today may not necessarily be what decisions you're going to make in a year or a year and a half or whatnot. And so educating kind of in the real time and making sure patients have what they need to be able to make those comprehensive and really difficult choices, sometimes treatment decisions, their steps forward.
It is such a difficult area too, because I'm thinking as you're talking about how, like, if I have to take my car in for repair, maybe I'll get like 2 quotes, but I'm not trying to learn how the engine works. I'm just kind of like accepting what they tell me. But I feel like in fertility care, people feel like it's their job that now they've got to go understand all the science because they get so nervous about making sure they're making the right decision.
Right. And I think it's just gotten so much more complicated now that we have access to so much genetic screening and those sorts of decisions that inform treatment choices. That in and of itself is really complicated to try to make sure patients know what they need to know. And since that science changes so quickly, we as nurses and other healthcare providers need to just keep learning as well. So that's definitely always a challenge.
That's what I love about this field, that we are constantly interested in, like, what's the research? What's the latest thing? I feel like this is different than just being in more of that birth realm where I think people are more resistant to change. I think everybody wants to be on the cutting edge. That's what's fun about it. But that's what makes it so challenging as a patient, because if you're trying to do your own research, especially if you're just typing into Google, you're going to get so many, and they might be good scientific articles, but they might be from 5 years ago, and we might have already kind of moved away from those findings.
That's right.
If I have patients listening, they've probably heard me say this before, but our field, the field of infertility, it seems very high tech, and it is in many ways, but there's just so much we don't know still. And that's what a lot of times when my patients are seeking answers and they want to know why I can't give them a black and white answer, is because there's so much gray in this field. That's also why I love this kind of research, because it tells me, like, okay, where can I be the most supportive? Where are my patients struggling? And where can I put my efforts of emotional support and helping them through this difficult process?
Yes, and I interrupted your list. So sorry. The first part is more sources for information.
So I think what Ruby said was a perfect segue, because that was going to be my second point, was the emotional needs. Making sure our patients are getting the support they need throughout the whole process. We as nurses, I think, are attuned to this part of healthcare, but we don't necessarily have as much space as we wish we could devote to that. But our job is making sure patients have what they need. And so for the patients who really do need additional support, making sure they have the resources to go see a licensed therapist, that they have a support group, maybe they have social network, some sort of level of support throughout, the in-betweens, so to speak, in between their touch points with their fertility setting.
And all through pregnancy, just like you said in the beginning, I feel like we don't talk enough about that's why it is nice for patients to get linked in with a network that's not just at our fertility clinic, because they're going to leave us. And that anxiety does continue throughout the rest of pregnancy and into parenting too. Honestly, there's always a lot to worry about.
There is. And, that's also an area of interest. I'm not doing any research on it right now, but, there has been some research looking at parenting after fertility treatment and how it is a little bit different. Is it vastly different? Not generally speaking. However, I think that for some people, it continues to be a very stressful experience. Maybe not any more stressful than somebody who did not go through fertility treatment, but somebody's ability to accept that parenthood is stressful in some ways can be hard. Again, I'm thinking even just anecdotally, I had, this friend many years ago who said to me, I don't feel like I can complain about all the late nights and the exhaustion because of everything that we went through. I don't feel like I am allowed to complain. And I remember saying to him, parenthood is really hard. And it's wonderful, but it's hard, and it's okay. It's okay to embrace all sides of it. And so I think for some people, just some of that unresolved anxiety around it can linger.
And I even see that at their very first OB visit when they're nauseous and they feel gross and they're like, oh, well, this is what I wanted. And I'm like, you can still complain about feeling gross. It's all
Totally.
right. You totally can. Like, please do. You deserve it. And
That's right.
Anne, I don't know, have we ever done, just speaking of emotional support, have we done the partner support groups?
No, there was a person in Seattle that founded one. So we would refer people out to his group. In the past, when I was leading our groups, I tried to see if people wanted to have their partner come to a visit, but people didn't want that, at least in my group. They kind of liked the bond that they'd built just among the group of women. And so it's something that we've talked about before, but yeah, there's just not as much.
So I actually did a follow-up study locally, where I recruited men with male factor infertility, but only men, and I asked them some quantitative questions as well, and qualitative to kind of how they wanted their healthcare. I had some other questions I wanted answered, but I did ask specifically about emotional support and how they might want their emotional needs met. Group therapy really wasn't popular.
Yeah.
It was more having things either peer groups or even something a little bit more web-based or anonymous. The answer was they wanted their emotional needs met, but not through the same ways that their partners wanted it.
Now, is the website still active, the one that we talked about a while ago?
Yep.
So that's a resource that we can definitely give to our patients and put in our show notes, because I think that was kind of what drove that, right? Like, how can we give people more of this information? So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So my research partner, he and I wanted to meet some of these educational needs, is where we've been spending a lot of our time, just providing good, solid information to help people understand their journey. So we developed a website called All About Fertility. There's little dashes in between all and about. We have topics, hopefully far-ranging topics that are all broken down fairly digestibly, and they're all written by experts. So they're all with an author's name, and you can read their bio. And these are clinical and research experts across the world that we've asked to author these topics. So, these are trustworthy people who are writing on these topics.
Wow, now I feel extra honored to have gotten to write for you. So trustworthy. Yeah.
Because it's about trust with our patients. And that's one of the things that I've always found frustrating when you go to, a WebMD or one of those type websites. They're probably written by very legitimate persons with good credentials, but you don't know because they don't have people's names on them. Mm-hmm. And so that was something that we felt very strongly about, was that people could see who was actually writing on these topics.
Awesome. Yeah. So we'll include that link in our show notes. It'll be interesting in the coming years and decades to see how all of this changes, because I feel like the openness to mental health, emotional support has changed significantly, and people are more open to doing therapy and having a therapist, talking about their therapy and their mental health issues and challenges. And it probably will translate into this field too, for how people deal with this kind of very unique situation.
When I think younger people communicate differently than we do too, at least the relationships that I see or that we see in younger family members, they're much more open about what they need from a partner, what they need in this moment. And hopefully that communication will make this experience not quite as bad as it's been historically. So.
I agree. Unfortunately, just even stigma around fertility and infertility is lessening. Public figures, pop culture people are telling their stories. People are realizing how common it is. And I think that just knowing that people aren't alone is so very helpful. I teach nursing, and I teach largely 20-somethings who are healthy and haven't started family building. And I always start off my lectures and I say, how many people have known somebody who has diabetes? And everyone raises their hand. And then I say, how many people know somebody who's dealt with infertility? And just a few people do. And I always say, well, it's more common. Infertility is more common than diabetes. And the reason you don't know that is because people don't talk about it. And that just, so for, at least for those few dozen students, their awareness goes up. But I think that now that more and more people are sharing their fertility journeys, and we're starting to see that with men a little bit, but definitely we've had more those who were diagnosed with female issues coming forward. And that really helps patients. And if you can decrease the stigma and you can say, yeah, I have this and I don't feel so alone, then maybe the next step is that I'm okay going to get some extra emotional help, whether it's through a therapist or support group or whatnot. Taking that next step is really important. I agree with you, Anne. I think it's happening. We're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, so those celebrities that are struggling with sperm health that listen to our podcast, please share your story. It's helping people.
It does.
All of those celebrities that were listening right now.
Or not.
Or if you're not a celebrity, share your story. It's helpful. You never know who you're going to help. And I have a lot of patients that are like, yeah, I actually shared my story with my coworker or whoever. And they're like, and I found out they had a miscarriage or they went through this. And it was so nice to hear from somebody that I didn't even realize went through something similar to me.
That's right, because people don't share, so they think they're the only ones experiencing it. That isolation can really be profound for some people.
I think that was a lot of information and it was so fun. And I could talk about, we say this every episode, Anne, but especially when it comes down to like the evidence and the research, I feel like Anne and I get very excited. You could probably hear it in our voices. We get very giddy.
And you're hitting my two favorite topic areas, emotional support and male factor, like my thing.
Yeah, this is your thing. This is Anne's episode.
A very special episode of The Whole Pineapple.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. This has been such a wonderful, rich conversation, and it's such a unique look into the background of what we do in the fertility field. So we are so appreciate you joining us.
Yes, I'm so happy to know you, part of that 1% PhD research. So you're always a wonderful resource, and I really appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Well, it's been a pleasure. I love talking about research, and I love talking about ways we can help our patients during this journey.
And all the nurses out there, consider research.
That's right. We need more.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.